A very good evening to you all. My name is Andy Kerr. I'm a member of the 2020 group. In my day job, I'm the Executive Director of the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, but my role tonight is to act as moderator for the panel that we'll have up in just a moment. And certainly I see my role today as really just trying to tease out both some of the issues that we've heard from Joe, but some of the other issues that are salient for whether Scotland can meet its low-carbon targets over the next few years. What I'll be doing is we'll have a boardroom debate, so I'll be essentially trying to generate a discussion within the panel for about 30 minutes or so, and we'll then open up to some questions from the floor for a further 15 minutes or so. I'm very aware that we will not have time to cover all your views, all the potential questions, and I apologize in advance. But what I would like to do is to try and ensure that the next 45 minutes or so tries to tease out some of the challenges we face, some of the opportunities we have, and how we can overcome some of the challenges, some of which Joe has flagged to us this evening. At the end, I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, to come and give some closing remarks before we go off for our drinks reception at 7:30. But let's get back to the present and the boardroom panel that we have coming up towards us. I have to say, when I was coming in this afternoon, I haven't been in this church for many, many years, and I was wondering whether, when I arrived here, whether I could find a neat segue between the characteristics of this church and the boardroom panel. And I was thinking along the lines of, old, elegant, with a sharp, modern, functional twist, shall we say. But that would actually do a bit of a disservice to the panel we have tonight, because individually, collectively, they have put their heads above the parapet. They have been key individuals in terms of taking forward some of the ideas about delivering a low-carbon society within Scotland, both within the political realm, within the business realm, and also with skills and learning development. So, without further ado, can I ask Joe first? Would you like to come and take your seat? You've already heard about Joe, so I won't go. That's the one. I won't say much more. Ian, please, would you like to come on up? Ian, as you'll all be aware, is the chair of the 2020 group, and he's been a driving force for the 2020 group. I think you'll also all be aware that he's the chief executive of SSE, which is Scotland's largest company. You probably will be less aware of some of the work that he does with the UK Sustainable Council for Sustainable Energy and work with other centres. Next, could I have Charles Hammond, please? Charles is chief executive of Forth Ports, where he's been for over 10 years. Forth Ports run port operations at 5 docks within Forth, the Forth estuary, as well as Dundee, the Tay, and Tilbury docks down on the Thames. Wendy Alexander. Again, many will know Wendy. She started life at Booz & Co., looking at organisational strategies and management. She then took a sharp turn into politics, both as special advisor to Donald Dewar, and then furthermore as a minister within the Scottish Government, finally ending as the leader of the opposition here. She's now Associate Dean at the London Business School, and is also has worked recently on finance as well. And finally, and very much not least, Cabinet Secretary John Swinney, who again needs little introduction from me. Thank you very much. So, what I'm going to do is just try and kick off the back of Joe's talk, some questions about some of the challenges facing Scotland and how we might go about it. Let me just preface my remarks, though, by pointing out that Scotland in 1990 had emissions of about 70 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. In 2010, which was the last year for which we've got good figures, the number was about 54.7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. So we've reduced emissions by of the order of 24%. And we've got a target in 2020 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 42%. So we're partway there. We've done some very good things. We've done some things less well. How do we move from where we are now to where we want to be in 7 or 8 years' time? So let me start by talking about the global energy markets. We've heard from Joe about the revolution that's gone on in shale gases, particularly in the US, where prices have plummeted. They're down now below $3.50 for a million BTU. And this is, as Joe said, having some serious knock-on effects around the world. We've seen a big import of cheap coal in Europe as a result of that. So let me just start with Joe. What do you think of the implications of shale gas developments for renewable energy globally? And we'll come back to UK specifically, just to tease out some of the comments you made earlier.
I think there are two things I think people need to think about quickly. It's essentially putting carbon tariffs on imports so that you don't deindustrialize your economies unintentionally. Two, it's not a given that there will be huge natural gas exports from the U.S. outside the U.S. There are a number of U.S. companies that are arguing to keep the exports internally for the jobs benefit. In particular, the vice president of Dow Chemical has gone that way. So I don't think it's a given that U.S. U.S. shale gas prices will result in low price gas here. I think it can have big effects on imports, and I think it will be used in an industrial fashion wherever practical by competitors.
Ian, do you want to add some thoughts to that? I'd say we'll come on in a moment to the UK situation in more detail.
You mentioned a couple of my hats. My third hat is I'm the non-exec director of John Wood Group, the Aberdeen Oil Services Company. I've been on the board there for 6 years, and I would absolutely echo what Joe said. Shale gas in the US is revolutionary. When I joined the board of Wood Group, it was not mentioned. It is a sizable business opportunity. In that case, a Scottish company. We, as a Glasgow company, have made big investments there as well. It has fundamentally changed the US energy picture in a way that nobody envisaged. So, the US has gone from talking about importing gas to should it or should it not export gas. And every US president since, I think, Kennedy has talked about the goal of US energy independence. I don't think you'll export the fuel, having found it. So what we've created is effectively two gas markets in the world, a US gas market and everywhere else. Joe, you talk about dollars per million BTU and all that. Probably most people in the audience don't know what that means. It means US gas prices are less than half they are in Europe. Wholesale gas prices less than half. So you are seeing the US re-industrializing. I was in the US in December and was shown the plans for a petrochemical plant that was originally designed for the Middle East and has been taken and put back into Texas. So you're seeing the US fundamentally change, and what the attitude is, this is okay because it helps us on the climate, because again, as Joe said, the carbon intensity of gas is less than half of coal, and it is displacing coal in the US. So they're saying, we can do our bit, shut up the rest of the world complaining about us, and we can re-industrialise, we can reduce our carbon emissions, we don't need renewables. The problem is you run the maths, in about 10 years' time, the world has to move beyond gas. Even if we replaced all of the coal generation with gas overnight, that only it buys us another 10 years. So what it's giving renewables is a bit longer to get its cost down, but actually the challenge will be bigger later. Does that attempt to answer your question? I could have done an hour.
Sure, no. Okay, let's bring it down to Europe, UK, Scotland. We've obviously got a political intention, more than that, within Westminster to see a dash for gas. Given that what you've just been talking about, how is that going to affect Scotland's renewable energy ambitions. I'm thinking both of the renewable electricity ambitions of 100% of its gross annual consumption of electricity, which I think currently works out at about 2/3 of total production, and 11% of its heat demand to come from renewable sources. How do you think that's going to play? Ian first, and I'll come on to Wendy in a moment.
My own view on this is that Scottish ambitions for renewables and a UK hybrid of renewables and gas can coexist. There is enough energy requirement in the UK for both of those to be met. And actually, back to Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage, Scotland is one of the best places in the world for renewable energy production. So absolutely Scotland should play to its strength and maximise its renewable energy production, not just in the UK context, but in a European context too. I think the interesting challenge, and we may come on to it, is, when in the UK we talk about investing in new nuclear, we don't mean the new nuclear that Joe, we mean building some new old nuclear stations. And I think that was a very interesting challenge. That is the fight I would take to London. We're in danger of backing the wrong nuclear technology at just the wrong time.
I think you can do it. I get to say things like "here, here," right?
Yep.
Here, here.
So,
okay, Wendy, thoughts?
Well, Joe did utter the phrase, I think, halfway through about "we are doomed," at which point I thought, well, you may be a Methodist, we may be in an Anglican church, but this is definitively a Scottish sermon that would do justice perhaps to "I am jolly," which we will explain after. That said, for those of you who know your religious history, the defining characteristic of Scottish Presbyterianism is collective redemption rather than individual redemption, and you did share with us, a fantastic sermon that gives us a sense of the systemic nature of the challenge, and I think the 2020 group are to be congratulated on promoting that debate. But coming right back to where we are beyond the "I am jolly" bit, we got it at the end, I think, to actually, as much as Adam Smith, what has brought about the shale revolution as an individual entrepreneur bringing about a technology. And if you look at the history of Scotland, whether it be James Watt or Alexander Fleming or many others, there is a point for technology. And one of the interesting and important things you showed us, Vinod Khosla, is that in Scotland, I think what's happened in the last 2 years even, is that we've moved beyond setting targets to getting the planning regime right onshore, to moving in the big offshore projects that Ian does, to saying we also can build an entrepreneurial ecosystem, not perhaps around just renewables, but around the whole of energy services and building out from oil services, and indeed what Scottish and Southern have done of moving over to Scottish Equity Partners, who I spend some time still working with on their venture portfolio, and really making Scotland a home for financing a range of energy technologies that build out from oil services and many other areas. It's something we weren't doing a couple of years ago, and we are now making that possible, and there's something about the Scottish ecosystem there that's precious and important.
Okay, so we've just touched on financing. Let's just run with that for a little while. We've seen this precipitous fall in private investment within Europe. I think McKinsey were making the point that it's of the order of 350 billion euros, a 14% reduction between 2007 and 2011. Given that we're talking about an energy revolution, how are we going to finance that, given the parlous state of public and consumer finances? John, do you want to offer something?
Well, let me just to complete the entire religious picture. I should say that our proceedings have been graced by the presence of a child of the manse as well, in Wendy Alexander, so she can offer a level of religious supervision to this whole process, which is utterly completes the process, but enhances it in every respect. I think that let me just say a couple of comments before I come on to your point, Andy, because I think what the key lessons I take from Joe's absolutely fascinating lecture have been the fact that we should formulate, and this essentially is the lesson I take from the United States example, you should actually develop the capability that you have on your doorstep and within your own scope, which is very much Wendy's point about not just renewables, and renewables have been a source of, I think our government has given very clear leadership to our ambitions on the renewables energy front, but it's also to be able to take forward some of the low carbon opportunities, and carbon capture represents an enormous part of that. And if I have one frustration and reflection over the last few years, is that part of it has been ponderously slow in terms of essentially the weaving together of all the different elements that have to be woven together to make one of these ventures fly. That's been a particularly slow part of the process, which has been a frustration to all of us. So therefore, making sure that we have in place the regime and the support, the priorities, and crucially the resources to realise the potential of the energy resources on our doorstep is fundamental to realising this challenge. I think there's two elements to raising the money. The first is the point that Wendy absolutely fairly makes. We've got to have powerful and dynamic entrepreneurialism and innovation in developing these products, and I think we've got a really good cluster of examples of that within Scotland. I think when we look at the way in which a variety of different, particularly offshore wave and tidal devices are being developed and tested in Scottish waters at the present moment, and many of them developed within the research institutes of Scotland, is a particularly important part of it. And making these propositions as compelling as we can is the access point to attracting investment. If the proposals aren't any use, then they won't attract any money. It's as simple as that. But if they are compelling propositions, then they should, all things being equal, attract investment. The second is to take a whole series of different steps to ensure that there is a very clear understanding that we are interested in this business and that we are open for this business. And that comes back to having policy clarity, that renewables will be central to the government's energy ambitions. Secondly, to tactical interventions such as hosting an annual low-carbon investment conference that brings to Scotland all of the people interested in low-carbon investment and making this a bit of a mecca for discussion. And that's been, I think, a particular success that has been taken forward. And thirdly, ensuring that whatever steps can be taken through the public purse, that we corral all of that investment and investment financing capability in a way that makes it as easy as possible for some of these ventures to develop. So making sure that our enterprise bodies, for example, are at the heart of supporting the companies taking forward these concepts is very important, and that I can make available through the public expenditure priorities of the government investment funds that can support that process helps fundamentally. But what I'm absolutely clear about is that we will not realise our renewable and low carbon energy capability without very, very significant private sector investment. And what we can do is corral a whole variety of different things that help that platform, but ultimately we still have to, in that very competitive environment, attract that international investment. And we are in the wider economic debate, we are in, I suppose, in that we're in that awful position that there's an unwillingness on the part of many people to commit to particular ventures just now. That's not about renewables and low carbon exclusively. It's about everything. We can barely get. We can barely give away grants to the farming sector in Scotland because people are not prepared to match fund them, because they're not prepared to make the commitment. And that's a challenge within the economy, which is certainly a European-wide challenge at the present moment, that we have to change the culture and the climate to create a better commitment to invest at this time.
Okay, thank you. Charles, a view from the private sector.
Yeah, I think the last few years have made people a bit more risk averse, and that's the difficulty perhaps in attracting some of the finance from the private sector. So, I mean, I look at this as very simple businessman, there are two things you need to make returns. One is certainty of income, and the other one is certainty in costs. And Ian's just made the comment that the shale gas situation has given us some breathing space to look at lowering costs in the renewables production and development. But when we look at the size of funding required for some of these offshore wind fields, and two of the largest ones, we're talking about sums of around about 35 to 40 billion pounds. So I have to agree with the Cabinet Secretary, that money isn't all going to come from the public sector, it's got to come as well from the private sector. And it seems to me what we need to get involved in here are some of the pension funds, whether public sector or private sector pension funds. They will lower the cost of capital in these kind of investments. The only way I can see that happening is if they have a framework for income certainty. Because I think the private sector, I think the developers, people like SSE will find ways of getting costs out the supply chain and manufacturing. But if there's income certainty and a government framework that delivers that income certainty in the right timescale, I think we'll start to see scale of private sector investment.
But just as a follow-up to a number of those points, one of the issues obviously with offshore wind is it is expensive at the moment, and that's being borne by the consumer. How long do you need in order to, or how long before you need to ensure the costs have come down within the supply chain to ensure that that's a viable technology going forward? Because at some point, people are going to be objecting to the fact they're paying more for something that they don't see back.
I don't. In the short term, Andy, I don't see the issues being a significant problem, in the sense that I don't think people's energy bills are not increasing, as my bill from Scottish and Southern Energy tells me.
I'm glad you're a customer.
I'm a very faithful customer, and I pay by direct debit just to make your head office smoothly operate in its excellent service. But my bill from Scottish and Southern Energy tells me that the biggest driver of rising energy prices is in fact the price of wholesale gas, and not in fact the cost of developing renewable technology. Now, I think I certainly can't see how the customer can bear all the development costs of offshore wind. That is my point about the private sector. That's where the risk climate has to see where are the long-term opportunities that arise from this, and that's why I think in terms of how we fulfil our requirement to generate energy in as sustainable a way as we can, because we have to operate in this country within the framework of the European Union. It's not a constraint that the United States has to observe, and that puts particular burdens on the choices that we can make and the options that we can pursue, given the commitments that we're making in terms of carbon reductions on a European level. So I think there is a framework there, which is Charles's point, which enables private sector investment to resolve this issue. The question is, can we accelerate that private sector investment? Can we make it happen with greater volume in the short term? Because the sooner we can make progress on this question, the sooner the investment opportunities will become more concrete for some of the other technologies that we want to take forward.
Andy, if I could pick up that question and just echo that something that was a key theme in Joe's presentation, it's jobs. You mentioned that jobs mattered in China to US politicians. They matter in Europe, they matter in the UK. And the answer to your question is, how long will people put up with the premiums? If there are jobs that are coming from it, they will put up with it for longer. But those jobs have to be here. That is why people like Charles are involved, because it's attracting manufacturing jobs to Scotland. It's attracting engineering design jobs to Scotland, because when people can see their children doing technical training or undergraduate or graduate degrees to lead to jobs in the renewables or the energy space more generally, they will allow a premium to be paid for longer. That is why jobs are at the heart of estimate, and we cannot have an energy policy that is not linked to an industrial policy. And to be fair to the Scottish Government, they were aware of that 3 or 4 years ago. It sort of dawned on London about a year ago that they needed to start thinking about that. And what we mustn't do is, I believe, what Germany did with its solar and exported all the jobs to China. We have to create meaningful, worthwhile, rewarding employment here.
Okay. Thinking slightly more broadly, we talked a little about energy markets, about access to finance. We, within Scotland, have set this phenomenal target. Yeah? How do we stay ahead of the curve? How do we ensure that, and I'm not just talking about renewables, I'm talking about much the broader context of how you deliver some of this low-carbon transition, the skills, the developments, and so on. And people have mentioned CCS. You know, we had world-leading expertise in CCS, we still do, but clearly if nothing is happening on CCS, that will go offshore, that will go away. How do we stay ahead of the curve? Wendy?
I think in your question are two different issues. There's an issue of hearts and minds, and one of the interesting things about this debate in Scotland is, you know, the politicians, whichever side they're on, are all on the same side in this debate, but we're just not talking to the rest of the country. So there is a piece about hearts and minds, and this endeavour is about saying we need to keep talking to take people with us about the level of uncertainty we are building into the future and getting people beyond the immediacy of the imperatives of the financial crisis to the risks we are running. And to that extent, I think Joe slightly glossed over that actually, yes, jobs is what China and the US shares, but in the context of the US, you have to win a democratic mandate. In China, you can drive it from the top down, and that does make for a different, evolving policy context. Coming back to us here, and I maybe just say in Hearts and Minds, we need to do more. The last time I was in a panel with you and you were urging us all to buy 3 trees. This time you're trying to give us two bikes. You know, but this is not a facile point.
Did you plant the trees?
I went to Dobies and I then had a dilemma about whether a miniature Japanese tree did it in terms of carbon.
By the way, this is why the Vattenfall curve is taking so long.
Well, I'm about to donate a business card to John because I recall that ministers are never allowed business cards, and John is the most serious cycler in the entire Scottish Parliament, so deserves to win this bike.
Help with my cycling in my advanced years.
But back to the more serious point of hearts and minds. I think there is a long way to go. And we need to think much more creatively about how we take people with us, because subsidies are going to continue to be important. Tariffs are a product of political debate and discussion, and we've dropped the ball in hearts and minds, and we need to re-engage in that.
But, I mean, I would take that absolutely. I think increasingly we are aware this is not a technology problem. It's a social and cultural context that we're dealing with. You know, how do we get the Scottish citizens to buy into the low-carbon transition? And I have to say, if I was to say, look, we've got politicians, energy company leaders, financiers sitting on a top table, they are not, shall we say, if you had a list of most popular people in the country, certainly in the UK, they wouldn't be at the top. What do we do to make sure that citizens across the piece are buying into that? John?
I think there's a number of different examples. I think that we can cite in terms of the contribution towards moving towards a more sustainable society. I think, you know, from the level of progress we've made on renewable energy, for example, where our, you know, I remember when the Labour administration that preceded us set what appeared a rather eye-wateringly ambitious 2011 electricity generation target from renewables for 2011. I looked at that and thought, my goodness, I didn't quite expect at the time that we'd be the administration at the time that would have to deliver it. And we exceeded it, and we did it earlier. So there's an element of policy leadership that can be applied to all of these things that can change. There are other perhaps more mundane elements of human behaviour which I think are encouraging in terms of the utilisation of resources and the degree to which members of the public faithfully participate in the recycling regime that we undertake. And I can see that in the communities that I represent, and we all faithfully put our respective bins out in an orderly fashion to contribute towards all of that, and there's a wider strategic picture on these questions. I think the big challenge that we have, I think probably the one that worries me most in terms of the achievement of our climate change objectives, is actually about transportation policy. That's the one that is of particularly significant challenge, where we're not making as much progress, frankly, on that as I would like, because that involves changing human practice and human behaviour. It does also involve putting credible options in front of people, and I'm sure once the emerging elegance of the Edinburgh tram system, which I'm now becoming, Wendy will be delighted to hear, I'm now becoming a strong advocate of the elegance of the tram system. There are various ventures and investments government has to make to try to change. You can't ask people to make changes in their transportation behaviour if there aren't credible alternatives in place. And we are now seeing a growth in public transport connections to try to assist that. We just announced, take for example the most recent announcement I made on the recent capital allocations from the UK government. We put more money into cycling infrastructure to recognise that if we want to get more people using bikes, electric or otherwise, we've got to put in place a more credible infrastructure to help them to do so. That's a big hearts and minds issue, because on the transportation question, we've got a big chance to get people out of their cars and onto other modes of transport.
Ian, very briefly.
Just Scotland has changed itself and changed the world many times over the last 300 years. There are many figures in Scottish history, Adam Smith that you mentioned, but you can look at Watt, you can look at Joseph Black, you could look at people like David Livingstone. Scotland has changed the world, and it's been that heroes have emerged. They've not been generally politicians, they've not been accountants, they've been entrepreneurs, philosophers, engineers. Scotland is rich in those things. We need new heroes that will change Scotland and change the world. Hopefully there's some potential people sitting here. They're probably younger than anybody on this panel. They're probably in their 20s now, but we need to create a climate where those heroes that can play on the global stage can emerge. So we don't have to invite learned professors from the other side of the Atlantic. We have our own, and actually Harvard are coming here to find out what's going on.
By the way, we do. Let me just comment, though. Remember, though, that Scotland has changed the world many times. To make all of this anything other than a futile effort, you have to change the world. China and India will emit more carbon tomorrow in the new plants they built last month than you've saved this year. You have to change the world. And to do that, it's going to take leadership, it's going to take government support, but it's also going to take those hard tools of mercantilism, tariffs, a focus on local employment and jobs, a steely resolve to educate voters so that you can stay in power, because in fact we, meaning both Europe and America, are cursed with this thing called democracy, not a thing my Chinese colleagues have to face. So we're going to have to present people a future that is realistic, and I think it's going to take some very hard and tough decisions because they're going to undercut you on climate. On industrial policy, they will do everything to bring that job there. And unless you organize with that in mind, I think you look into Pandora's box too quickly. So there's some tough-mindedness in this, and the world doesn't need to educate Scots on tough-mindedness.
Okay, just taking that and moving it on. I mean, one thing we've been talking a bit about fuels, about generation. An absolutely key thing within Europe, around the world, is about resource efficiency, energy efficiency. How is Scotland going to deliver, given the chart that you showed, Joe, of all these things down at the bottom left of the Vattenfall curve, which apparently suggests that energy efficiency is easy, or at least cost effective, and in practice it may be cheap, but it's very hard to do. How are we going to deliver that, Charles?
I mean, again, taking a simple business approach, we, over the last 3-4 years, have improved our energy efficiency, but still grown our business. It is about hearts and minds. It is about changing people's behaviour, and it has to be done as much from the bottom up as the top down. We were very simple about it. We said to everybody, the more energy you save, the more energy efficient you become in our business, in our different businesses, the more jobs you save during a recession, during a financial crisis. And we didn't lose one job during the financial crisis. And it has changed people's behaviour. So some of the low-hanging fruit to the left of Joe's chart are things we've been doing in business. It becomes more difficult when you translate that into the consumer and the homeowner and so on. Interesting, the Green Deal is something which I personally wasn't aware of and didn't understand until yesterday. And you know, you look at what's being offered in the Green Deal, and I think the proposition is that what you have to do as a consumer is trust the building industry, the utility companies and the government as a consortium, and that's a pretty difficult thing to do.
Oh no, we've involved the banks as well. we thought they'd add.
And the lawyers, yes.
And on top of that, I think the consumer's being asked to borrow money at somewhat high rates of interest. So I think it's going to be very difficult to win hearts and minds at that level unless there's some really good selling, some really good incentivisation towards perhaps the easier implemented energy efficiency measures. And I think we have to have, Ian talked about heroes, I think we have to have local heroes in Scotland at that level championing these kind of measures. I think the other thing that may help at that level is possibly combining these measures with perhaps microgeneration, which starts to see some kind of income being produced from initiatives as well, whether it's power or renewable heat.
Wendy, you're smiling.
There's a thing in politics called the pub test, and free prescriptions and a free bus pass pass the pub test. And the Green Deal, good idea, but miserably fails the pub test of, how do you do it? On that, just on the energy efficiency one, if I look at SEP's portfolio of companies and where the interest is coming from, and they are open to business and they've got money and they want to lend, lots of the interesting ideas in there are in energy efficiency with the right consumer edge on it. So whether it be about smart grids, smart meters, changing consumer behaviour, grey water, that whole microgeneration, there is huge activity going on there that needs supported and stimulated. And also to come back to the point about heroes, I now work at London Business School, and our brightest, youngest MBA graduates, these are not the engineers who have the fantastic ideas. These are people who want to make money, and they used to want to make money in investment banking. They now want to make money being the CFO to an interesting engineer, and they want to do it in the clean tech space. Of our entire 90% of the students are globally drawn, and of all the clubs on campus, the most active is the Energy Club, and the Energy Club is driven by clean energy because it is the sexy, interesting, morally superior area to be. And there are lots and lots of people in this room who have been at this business for 20 years. And there are lots and lots of bright, financially savvy 20-somethings who, more than working for McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, now want to work for your business, but they just don't know how to connect. And there will be the heroes.
Okay, thank you. My final question, and it has to be asked. There has obviously been a lot of debate about the referendum on independence. and whether this will have an impact on investors. How do you think this will impact on the plans for Scotland's low-carbon transition, John?
I think the key point I come back to is the point I made in my first contribution, which is about developing the strengths and the capability that we have in this country. And we've got, beyond any form of doubt, the most fantastic renewable energy opportunity in Scotland today. And, you know, that's not something that can kind of go away somewhere else. It's here. And as a consequence of that, what we've got to do is to make sure that we create the conditions in which that can be realised and fulfilled. You know, there's a great kind of discussion about this question about whether or not the referendum will in any way impinge on that. If I look at the scale of committed investment that's come whilst this debate is very live, £900 million of private sector investment which has been committed in terms of 2012 to the renewable energy sector in Scotland, to me is an encouraging indication that investment decisions are made based on what can be achieved within the environment and circumstances around Scotland. What we've also got to do is to make it absolutely clear that the overriding consideration in all of this must be policy certainty and confidence. And I think that's the major contribution that we've made since 2007, is to give absolute certainty that this is where the action is going to be and this is where the government is going to position itself to realise this opportunity. And I think that combination of the natural opportunity we have on our doorstep and the absolute policy clarity is the essential combination that we require to ensure that we realise that potential.
Okay. Final comment, Joe, on this before I pass some questions to the floor. I mean, Vista.
Look, the only thing that I would wrap up, and every time I come here, the thing that I leave knowing is that the resource that makes Scotland special is Scots. These tough-minded, data-driven, hard-working, disciplined folk. And so I think what you got to do is make sure that the people stay here and can pursue opportunity here. And that can overwhelm any question. On the issue of dissolution, is that what it's called?
Independence.
Independence. I mean, it depends on who you talk to, right? I never know how to talk about those things. I'm a child of the American South. Just don't try to do it the way we did.